each and every one of you here with us today for the launch of John Ruth's new book, This Very Ground, This Crooked Affair. I'm Joel Horst Nofziger. I'm the executive director at the Mennonite Heritage Center, and I think we have a wonderful opportunity of learning and sharing with us ahead of us this afternoon. There will be a time for questions and answers after the program, both for those here in person with us as well as those watching online. So as you have questions, hold them and cherish them, knowing there will be a chance to ask for an answer. John Ruth hardly needs any introduction here. He's an author, historian, and documentarian. He's brought Mennonite stories to our attention for more than 45 years, and we're glad to celebrate the launch of his latest book with us today. But before we hear from John, we'll also have a quick word from Michael King, the owner and publisher of Cascadia Publishing House, who has played an important role in bringing the book to light, and he will share a few words of reflection with us. Now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Michael.
Thank you, Joel, and welcome to all of you. It has been a privilege to connect with John for many years. This includes when, for a time in the early 1990s, we were both here on the Salford Mennonite Church preaching team, along with Willis Miller and Richard Detweiler. And over the years, in relation to our respective writing and publishing interests, one way I can track our history with particular projects is through my email databases. I was interested to see that the first reference to the book we're launching here was dated 2016 and was set in motion when John wrote an account of his research into the Lenape for the news sheet of Salford Mennonite Church. Then for some years, John worked primarily in collaboration with Phil Ruth, who oversaw much of the book's development, including layout of text, cover design, and persons who helped copy edit and proofread. Phil deserves special thanks for shaping this very ground, this crooked affair, to the point it was picked up by Cascadia Publishing House. Now it's 2021. Much has happened since 2016, but what a delight to celebrate with John, with Phil and team, with convener Mennonite Heritage Center, led, as you just experienced, by Joel Horst Nofziger, with this host here, Salford Mennonite Church, and with all of you, this special book's arrival. I expect I and we will long be digesting its implications. I've often traveled to Montana with my wife Joan to work from the road while she does mental and behavioral health consulting, including with Native American tribes. Because Montana tribes were long segregated on reservations, the traumas inflicted on them are more obvious than in southeastern Pennsylvania, where I've experienced names like Perkasie, Wissahickon, Unami, Manayunk, Conshohocken, Perkiomen, and so many more without adequately grasping the reality of the flesh and blood people whose spirits they still echo. In Montana, I found it heartbreaking to learn of that 1891 day the Salish Native Americans were sent into exile across the Higgins Bridge in Missoula to live in the Flathead Reservation. Mourning their departure, they dressed in their ceremonial best. A few blocks up the Clark Fork River, they would have been able to see Mount Sentinel, at whose base they once camped, today rising above the University of Montana's Grizzly Stadium and emblazoned with a huge M. Often as I returned from such trips where the sorrow was so unavoidable, the pace of work on John's book was picking up. I'd find my mind roaming back and forth across the Montana traumas and the reality I could now see more clearly through John's eyes. My own home in Salford Township is part of what was once the beloved Lenape homeland. I and many of you live amid crooked affairs and tears. I rarely glimpsed before John started telling of his own land's interface with all of this. In his preface, John says that, as Kathleen Norris observes, the fact that one people's frontier usually displaces another's homeland is mostly overlooked. But why, asks John, should the lament of the displaced be any less of the story's music than the grateful praise of the displacers? Thank you, John, for so hauntingly asking this question. We now ask it with you. God bless.
First, testing. Am I on? Thank you. I'm amazed that people would turn up like this, even with masks and things like that. But what is a sign to me that we're at a certain hinge point in American history when we're asking certain questions. When we were growing up, we, at a certain point, reading certain books, for me at age 7, I don't know when it was for you, we imagined what it was like to be Indian. And here, I lived at the junction of the Indian Creek with the Perkiomen, just a mile down here, next to the Indian Creek Brethren Church and the Indian Creek Reformed Church, and the Lutheran Church, also Indian something, Indian Field, and the Franconia Mennonite congregation was originally Indian Field, and the Souderton Indians, and the slogan Indian Valley, which is funny because 113 is on the rise, but it's called Indian Valley, and we know nothing about those Indians. And it didn't make sense, and I got curious, and I'm going to make the point a couple of times. I know this is happening for Jason here too. Why don't we know more than that? We're no more interested in that. And I found, frankly, that we Mennonites, we didn't know our own history either here. We're a bunch of ignoramuses, but do we ever talk about things and have opinions? And I didn't come to this book with opinions, but with questions. I put my thoughts in a virtual presentation, which Steve Schwendy will try to put up on the screen here. Runs 20, 25 minutes. Then I'll have a few comments on that afterward. Go ahead, Steve. Hello, my name's John Ruth, and I've written a book. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about it, why I wrote it, what the title means, and give you a glimpse of what's coming. I was born and raised on a farm, a 200 and some year old farm on the Clemens Homestead, 29 miles north of Philadelphia. And to live on a farm is to live on land. And to get, in my case, get to know 110 acres, through which flowed the northeast branch of the Perkiomen Creek, which is a tributary of the Schuylkill River, which is a tributary of the Delaware River, which flows into the Atlantic Ocean. In my 40s, I began to develop a kind of an irrepressible interest in where on the map I had been born and raised and where I was living. My cousin Jake Landis and I grew up on the farm together, and we related to the creek. And when there was an overflow and some fish were stranded, we pretended we had caught them. We were formed in the wombs of our mothers who ate food from that land. We had a relationship to it. We lived working that land. I plowed this field, and I remember with my dad on the other tractor, disking as I was plowing, and now I can recall hearing him sing. We sang on the land. He was on the other tractor. We were adjacent to another farm taken from the original Clemens homestead. That land is now a thickly settled tract of homes developed by a developer from the city. When we bought that land, when we could pay for it, we were given a patent, which is an open declaration that we owned that land. The people who had lived there before, the Delaware Indians, of course, would not understand that language or that transaction. In Franconia Township was the land of the Hagee homestead, and that homestead had a man who cared about the history of the land, and he drew a map. And that map, across from what later became Mopac Industry, indicated the place of an Indian grave. The Indian Creek flowed into the branch of the Perkiomen just adjacent to our land. In 1962, an 8-year-old boy started searching that land, and he found a piece of, he thought, and it was, Indian lore. Today, Lee Hallman's house is full of evidence of his searching fields, not only right around my homestead, but for miles around. Next to us were the Zieglers. Here they're husking corn, and on their farm, they found a trove of artifacts, hundreds in fact, every time after rain fell on plowed fields. A man in Hilltown Township named Harold Hockman kept finding things. The paper showed a picture of him, but no one knows today where his treasures went. Tim Moyer found things also along his place on the branch. It was a heavy crop. Bill Delp had a farm, which is today a corporate headquarters. And on that farm, Washington's troops gathered at Toamenson in 1777. Tim Moyer found a cannonball there, or someone found it there and gave it to him. And then on the adjacent Kriebel farm, there was another set of findings. That's where they found this arrowhead, as we call it. Over in Hilltown Township, Chuck Strauss kept finding things along what we would call the 113 corridor, right where the Mincy Trail headed north toward where the Munsee, or the Wolf tribe of the Delaware, lived in the Lehigh country. Here in Lower Salford Township was the Maxatawny Trail. Just a bit of evidence remained, yet when I saw it in the 1970s. Today, much of the topsoil, as we call it, of Lower Salford, Franconia, Hatfield, and the adjacent townships is piled up or pushed aside, and we'll never find anything there again. Abram Harley was a Dunkard, and he lived along the Indian Creek, and he listened yet in the late 1840s, and he heard people talking about Indians living along what we call the Indian Creek. And he, living there, told about what the Prices remembered. They had a tradition that their immigrant forefather, Daniel Price, had married a Lenape girl. In 1930, I went to Paraguay on a film job, and there I saw Indians. This is what they looked like when the Mennonites arrived in Paraguay in 1930. But this is what they looked like when I was there, and I found that they were friendly. I talked with some boys, I talked with some men, and a friendly woman, and I came home wondering why our Indians had not stayed with us as they stayed with the Mennonites who didn't come there until 1930. We moved to the little village of Vernfield in 1971, and only then found that we were again, that is my wife and I and children, we were just backed up against the Branch Creek, only a mile or two up from where I had been born. Then we moved again, back to the homestead, only 400 or 500 feet from the branch in the house I was born in, and my wife made a beautiful fraktur wall piece there with the verse from the book of Psalms, "The earth is the Lord's." Only later, after we had put all the initials of my 4 parents who had owned it for 7 or 8 generations, did I think about the fact we had no indication there of the people that had owned it for thousands of years before we came. My cousin, Walton Hackman, a farmer from Hatfield Township, had served as a conscientious objector at Red Lake, Ontario, and he told me that instead of going to the mission church there on Sunday evenings, he went home with the local Indians and listened to their stories, which he said went back to creation. He brought slides home of what he saw there, and he told me that when I saw the bulldozers come to our farm, I could feel what the Indians felt. Realizing that I didn't know much, I traveled a lot. I got to Switzerland and saw where my ancestors came from in the Emma River Valley of Bern. I traveled to Lancaster County, visited where the Conestoga Indians lived and then were massacred in 1763, the remains of them. I traveled all the way to Oklahoma. And there I met the family of Touching Leaves woman. She had been in my community and I hadn't realized it, but I missed her by 3 weeks. Her husband gave me some ears of corn, of maize, to bring home. Then as 1992 approached, which was the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery, if you want to call it that, I thought that we should recognize that time, and my wife made another fraktur in which I had her insert some statements of friendship by the Lenape Indians of my community. We invited D. and Annette Ketchum. At that time, he was a ceremonial chief of the Lenapes at Bartlesville in northeast Oklahoma, and they came north to visit us on that anniversary. We took them to the village of Veracruz, or where there's a Jasper Park, as it's called, where the Indians would find Jasper points. I was given by D a feather. You know, the Indians called William Penn Feather, and both the Iroquois and the Lenape had their own names in their language for Penn, which was feather. That eagle feather is precious, and it hangs in our living room today. I'm only joining the effort to think a little harder and think a little more with a little bit higher resolution about what happened when we took over this land. You can see it now in many good works of fiction and even poetry, especially a poem by Daniel Hoffman in 1981. You can Google it. I would like to recommend Erwin Stutzman's fiction. He came here to Branch Valley, and I helped him find maps and chronologies. He wrote an excellent fictional account of some of the goings on in the French and Indian War. And then there's the work of James Landis, very extensive, very carefully researched. It's fiction, it's fictionalized, but it's based on absolute solid scholarship with maps. I would recommend his work. You can Google it, James Landis. I was helped in writing my book by my son, Phil. Even as a boy, he was interested in learning history. When we moved to Vernfield, he depicted himself afloat on the branch. He became familiar with a painting by a Souderton artist of the branch, and he even commissioned by a painting by Bill Bach of a depiction of the passenger phenomenon. Well, Phil became a writer himself. He's written over 24 historical books, starting with material around here. He did a North Penn portrait, and in it he has a picture of local Pennsylvania Dutchmen playing at being Indians. He edited a memoir I did a few years ago called The Branch. It took very expert work, and I do believe there's a few on hand here this afternoon if anyone would like to get them. It's a memoir in pictures based on my life here and then in my travels, and including my connection with looking at the Indian history of the region. My publisher, Michael King of the Cascadia Publishing House, has his studio in an old horse barn along the branch too, just several miles upstream. You know, we are very proud of Edward Hicks's repeated paintings based on the idea of the peaceable kingdom. They're very friendly, and they make us look very good. A more realistic painter was a Swedish man named Hyselius, and he gave us pictures almost photographic-like of two Lenape headmen, Tishikunk or Tishkohan as he called him, and Lapawinzo, who lived along the Lehigh at present-day Northampton. Was I really aware of the Schuylkill watershed I lived in, like the Indians had it in their minds? I was started to give talks about the Indians, and people listened, and I began to realize that I didn't know much. Did I know that the Schwenkfelders had given money to the Quakers to make peace with the Indians? Did I know that my Mennonite minister, my predecessor at the Salford Mennonite Church, also was involved sending money to Israel Pemberton and trying to give gifts to the Indians to find reconciliation in the violence of the French and Indian War? No, I didn't know that. But I did travel to Oklahoma again in 2006, and there, listening to a Mennonite minister and Cheyenne peace chief, Lawrence Hart, I heard the story of how George Custer, whose ancestors came from Mennonites at Skippack and who could still speak Pennsylvania Dutch, had slaughtered the Cheyennes on the Washita, including Black Kettle, the chief who came before Lawrence Hart. While there, Lee Hallman came along with me, and we visited the Lenape Center near Bartlesville there in northeastern Oklahoma. And we met Jim Rementer, a man grew up in Ambler, but moved out there to Oklahoma and was taken in by a Lenape family and has today become the promoter and the organizer of a tremendous online Lenape talking dictionary. I traveled also to Bethlehem to see the graves there of the Moravians, who were special friends of the Indians, including gravestones with Indian names, unique in Pennsylvania. I traveled out to an oak tree that was big already then, now it's over 400 years old, that is sacred to the Indians, and they will still gather there and they will drum in remembrance. I traveled up to the Senecas in New York to their museum. I saw many markers. There was the marker of the slaughter of the Jacob Leroy or Jacob King family near Shamokin or Sunbury at Penns Creek. I saw another marker for Indians, where Indians killed Mennonites in Berks County. And I saw a marker in Bucks County for the walking purchase, 1737. That was interesting. And the marker is still standing there at Ottsville, but I had a remarkable experience there in 2011 when I went with some Lenape Indians to look at it, it elicited a remarkable response from them. I wasn't the same after that. I went down to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and did some research. I considered the role of William Penn and found I could learn a few things about him. He was a remarkable man, and we should hear from him. He's not to be easily explained. He was a disappointed man, but a man that we should hear from again in our time. I looked at his collected works, but here not everything was in them. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania had a copy of a letter in which he told his secretary, James Logan, "Here come the Palatines. They're Mennonists. They will neither fight nor swear. Treat them with gentleness and love so that they will send over a good description." I knew who was on that boat. Gerhard and Ann Clemens. Henry Culp, the first Mennonite bishop, lived at Skippack. Well, I started writing my book, and I had a title now made up of two quotes. One from a famous Indian chief of the Lehigh group, the Munsee group, Tidiuscum, who, when was asked, really, what are you Indians complaining about? He stamped his foot and he said, "This very ground was taken away from me by fraud." And where did I get the second part of my title, this crooked affair? Well, I got it from James Logan, who was the secretary of Penn. When he heard how the surveyor and speculator had sold land without proper legitimate deeds and spent the money and just handed in the Mennonites promissory notes for what they hadn't paid up front, Logan said, "That's a crooked affair." Now, I have to think about the fact that the land I celebrated on, that I lived on, that I inherited, from the Lenape point of view, and even from William Penn's secretary's point of view, it was a crooked affair. What am I celebrating? I want to understand, not to condemn, not to get mad and have some big ideological chance, simply curiosity. What really did happen? Dave Peters is interested in the whole project of having a fresh encounter with this fascinating and peaceful and wise and compassionate and memorable man, William Penn. And Dave came to our homestead and sent up his drone to get a picture of it. Dave edits on in his studio on this very grounds. He attends the Salford Mennonite Church next to the Clemens homestead. He's been at Pennsbury And who is he making this documentary with? Abby Abildas. She is with Dave and Kathy Peters. They are in the process of creating this very significant documentary. They came to our house, and there Abby spoke from our living room underneath my wife's proctor. She spoke about William Penn and his legacy. And she spoke to folks listening over in New Zealand. There's a message to go forth from our encounter with the land, with the Lenapes, with William Penn. That's what my book is about. This book is a musing. It's built not on anger or ideology. I know about the doctrine of discovery, and I sure don't like it. But the book was written out of curiosity. What happened? Did the Lenapes say something? They sure did. What did they say? When did they say it? Where did they go in the next 80 years after William Penn was here? That's what the book is about. There's not a word of fiction in it, and it's not written by a professional historian. But it asks this question: can we look at what happened here from our Lenape friends, descendants, from their point of view? Or as we're better informed with our growing digitized, instantly available data, we can even see McGoxton's signature on the land when he gave the Perkioma to William Penn for 2 coats, 4 pair of stockings, and 4 bottles of cider. Looking at it that way, can we ask, since that's what happened on this very ground, which can also look like a crooked affair, what would be an appropriate response? Thank you. Oh, thank you, Dave Peters. We put that together in a crash program. Where are you, Dave? Are you here? I apologize for the parts in it that reflect my naivete, but Dave stitched it together, and I deeply appreciate it and recommend his project. He's going to put together to let William Penn speak. I admire William Penn. See, this book, there's not a word of nonfiction, of fiction in it, because we have good fiction, and I like it. I like good fiction, but I didn't feel that was my gift, and so I simply said to myself, what can we say, what can we find that we know the Lenape said? And sure enough, it's there. It's recorded. And it's not hostile until they finally realized, after they had to leave the Neshaminy and the Tohickon and the Perkiomen and the Tulpehocken and then the Susquehanna. And when they were out in Ohio and found they had to leave there too yet, the French said to them, look, what are you dealing with the English for? What do you get out of it? When you can live with us. We'll intermarry with you. The English just take up the land. And so when the English sent over a general, Braddock, and he marched with drums and flags up to the junction of the Monongahela and the Ohio, and the Indians just wiped them out from the bushes as they strutted on their horses, and including General Braddock himself. The French said, see how easy that was? What do you have left after you've dealt for now 80 years with William Penn and his descendants? Nothing. You have to keep on moving. You chase them back to the coast, and we'll have your back. And the Indians bought it. And they regretted it within a couple of years and very cautiously came back. And I tried to narrate that process, how the chief, his nephews, Kamakwa and Pisquetaman and Shingas, cautiously came back and had a series of treaties, and then thought they had it settled again in 1763, only to have a terrible massacre out in Lancaster, where the last 20 of the Conestogas were slaughtered, even though they were hidden in the jail. And it sort of fell apart again. So I only narrate from the time that, well, I start in 1744. Why? Because that's when William Penn was born, and that was when Hans Stauffer, whose daughter, adopted daughter, got the land that I live on, when he was born in Switzerland. And then I take London, where William Penn was, and the Emmental in Switzerland, and then here in the Perkiomen, and I tell these stories side by side. And I don't have any illusions that it's going to keep people awake, although I'm going to brag a little here. Joel Nofziger just told me he read it in a day, and I think there'll be people who will sit there and go to sleep with a paragraph or two, but they have my blessing. Anyway, what are we going to do next in this book launch? Will you tell us, Joel?
Don't go too far, John. Now is the time for questions and answers. And I'm afraid I'm going to take pride of place here because I can in asking the first question. And John, is one of the things you pointed out is that we have these linguistic ghosts covering our local landscape here, reflecting the original people of the lands. How should we deal with those places in a way of respect and not a crooked affair?
Well, that's sort of the question I ask. In fact, the first person who responded to reading of the book came to our house last Sunday, was it already? MHEP has done a good job of hawking this book on ahead. And my publisher says he's got dozens of orders on Amazon.com, right? Before we even kick it off here, but the first question came is, what should we do about this? Now, you know the standard thing is to get angry. And start spouting at each other and how bad our ancestors were, how they didn't treat the Indians right and all that. If you and I lived then, we'd have done the same thing. So the first thing is to get acquainted a little bit. That's the strategy. And then there might be. You know, Lee found over 600 pieces in the front field over here at the CSA, at the Indian Creek here. Maybe I'm jumping ahead. You know, would it be wrong to put a kind of a stone monument there where the Indian Creek comes into the Perkiomen? Or let's not get ideological right away. I mean, I don't believe in the doctrine of discovery. I say in the book, when James Logan sat down with Sassunin in Stenton, his big Palladian mansion down here near Germantown, and explained to him, he said, the king of my country, and William Penn said this himself to us, the king of my country has given me some land here. Well, where did the king get it? Those questions really weren't answered. So first, let's think about that and how it would look. Now, to be honest, not everybody's going to like this book, neither conservatives or liberal. The conservatives won't like it because it made me read 2 Samuel and 1 Kings different. When I find in there that David looked up in the ridge and saw a place called Zion. That's it, that's what I want. Well, he said, the Jebusites live there. Well, and you can't have it because they keep the lame and the blind there. And David says, well, I hate the lame and the blind. I'm going to kick them out. You never hear about the Jebusites again, just like we don't hear about the Lenapes again. And that made me think I need to, when Jesus went in the temple when he was 12, he told all those people what was what, right? No, he asked questions. And I think that's the way we should approach this. We first inform ourselves a little bit. And I thought this book is just bring us to the point to make us ask the question you just asked. And I close this little thing with that question. What's an appropriate response? In the book, I talk about the fact that the Hockman Farm. Do any of you know where the Hockman Dairy Farm is in Bucks County? Anybody here? Not many, a few. Well, they're one of the last Mennonite dairy farms, and we have the Nichols, right down here at the Indian Creek in the Perkiomen. And I asked them why they called it Penview Farm. And they said, well, because when the barn was built here, before the Hockmans even bought it, somebody standing there with binoculars looked down toward Philadelphia, and they could see Billy Penn on top of City Hall. So they call it Penview Farms. Well, asking dumb questions like that might be more, I felt more instructive than having some high-powered academic, which I am not, give us a bunch of concepts and about, let's just think about this. What would be, see, Gerhard Clemens's father-in-law had to walk from Switzerland 200 miles north to a place along the Rhine where there was a little more toleration. Hans Ruth and his wife came up there. They had 1 or 2 children, and the only thing recorded that they brought with them was 1 blanket. After the Bernese kicked them out. So here's these people that come over here, and they get, Anne Clemens and her husband Gerhard get 690 acres. They thought they only bought 585, but the surveyor got it wrong. And when William Penn's son, Thomas, came over here, he ordered a new survey, and they found out they had bought another 90 acres more than they thought they had, then, so they could pay up on their annual tax. I just thought it would be better to get a little closer to that texture and then have our discussions and then answer the question you asked me right now.
Well, if you have a question, I'd ask you to stand up and be loud, and then I will repeat it into the microphone. The question is whether John has relationships with any Lenape closer than Oklahoma and whether those could be continued.
Well, 2 parts to that. First, how about DNA? I claim 1/512th, but it hasn't been proven by DNA, and I think it's mostly local legend. In fact, many people in this community claim vaguely through the Price connection. In fact, I was just told recently by someone that we descend from an Indian princess along the Indian Creek that Daniel Price married. Well, there's no written evidence of that, but there is a strong legend. That would be the only physical relation I would have. No, I went to college with a Ketchum, and I got to meet a Lenape man who lived, this is over a decade ago, who lived over toward Pottstown Valley Way, who moved away from here because his daughter was being harassed in school. He moved way out into Port Allegheny. And I went to a couple of meetings with him, and he said he had never read any Lenape history, but he had his oral history. And someone in our group said, "Well, what about Mr. Ruth? What's he saying?" He said he's telling you the truth. You know, the Lenapes, many of them are like half Lenapes. They intermarried a lot. The Lenapes are by nature very friendly. You know, most of them are out. The biggest group are out in Oklahoma. There are two groups there, Western and Eastern. They're in several other groups. There's one group that went up into the Grand Valley and River Valley in Ontario. And I heard a story there that charmed me. A Mennonite man told me that from his ancestry, they were told that a Mennonite man bought some of that Grand River land from an Indian, and they made an agreement that every year he would give half of the crop to the Lenape Indian. And one year, there was a kind of a drought, so he only got half a crop, but he owed that much to the Indian, and he gave it to him. And then in the ensuing conversation, the Lenape asked him how he did. Well, he told him. And when the Indian realized that he had given him all in order to pay his debt, which was the white person's way of thinking, the Indian said, no. He said, here, he gave half back. He said, we both have to have something. You find, William Penn talked about the generosity of the Lenapes. He said, give them a gun, give somebody a fine gun, it may pass, I forget how he said, 20 hands before it sticks. The Indian language was gifts. To William Penn's son, who was just interested in the money, and to the proprietary party that came after William Penn was gone, land was worth money. That's what it was. And you know, when we give our 7-generation homesteads, for some people, all it means is how much you'll get for that final price, instead of the memory of we were born out of that land. We had a relationship to it, and the Indians didn't have that relationship to it, and they knew the language of gifts. Now, what was the question? Okay. So I don't have any personal relationship except my friendship. Jim Remender and I talked to him on the phone from down in Bartlesville, the man that has the Lenape Talking Dictionary. And as I told you, he grew up down here on the Wissahickon near Ambler. And somehow he got down there and he was taken in by the family of Talking Leaves woman. And they just took him in. And now he's, I don't know, he must be in his 70s, and he is now the promoter of their language, and you can hear their language online. That's the closest relationship I would have.
Mine maybe is more of a comment, but I just want to thank John that you took the time to tell a history that's complicated. There's so many facts involved, there's no simple answer to it. And once you spend a decade of your lives trying to put it all together, and one of the things that come to mind is you mentioned Loganoff. And Shikellamy, who died up in Shamokin, down on Sunbury, his son took on the name Logan.
Yes.
He made his famous Logan's Lament. Take a look at that later in Google, Logan's Lament. And when he passes on after they murder his children, he says, who's there to remember Logan? But it's so mixed up by his own name, nobody remembers even him. They're not quite sure what his given name is as a Cayuga. So it's an interesting story. I'm glad we're getting the dialogue going, because there's really no simple discussion to it. It takes time and discussion versus one way is right and that. I just appreciate that you're doing this.
Less a question, more comment.
Jason Sirach speaking here.
Would you would you like to give the summary, John? Well, here. Yes.
Okay,
Just say your name. Jay.
sure. Yeah, I'm Jason Siroc, and yeah, take it off. Yeah, makes it a lot better. And I've been doing some research for the past decade on my Moravian ancestors. And John brought me in to see, as you read a little bit about the Moravians, and maybe now that I have the microphone, make a real quick statement, is the best way to describe the Moravian missions are, they weren't perfect, but led by the Holy Spirit, they went in to tell the true message, and they did the best they could, where they came to the natives and they took some things from them in order to make them look more appealable to the whites, in order to protect them. Not because they were condemning them, but because they knew if they looked like good Christians, maybe people would leave them alone. But when they did this at these missions, they also gained a lot. It's kind of a halfway. But that's the story, and what I said is to get back what my comment was to John is, it's a very difficult topic. There's a lot of details, and he's right to say when you read it, you have to read it slowly and you take it all in. And my comment was that he mentioned often Logan, and what came to my mind as a comment was Shekelme the Great, who was known as the Enlightener, was the king of the leader of the Iroquois of all Pennsylvania. And his son took on the name Logan because of this Logan who stole all the property. And what's interesting is even when he lived, no one can be sure of his given Cayuga name by his mother and his father due to that fact. So that was my point, is just great time to get this discussion. I'm just so appreciative that John did it. That's mainly what I said.
We would have time for perhaps one more question. Well, we'll take the two of you.
Yes, I'm wondering, the Indian grave across from Hallman's Creamery, can you tell us more about that?
The question was about the Indian grave at Holman's Creamery.
How many of you know where Hallman's Creamery is? Wow, a lot of you. If you go up the road there with Hallman's Creamery on the right, there's a field on the left. Henry Hagee lived close by there, and he did a map of all that area. And he said that there was an Indian grave, and he marked it on his map. And he said, William Penn said, the Indians never forget a grave. And he said that it was a local memory that an Indian would come periodically and sit on that grave and lay a leaf of tobacco on it. And when he left, the Clemmer hired man would come and smoke that leaf. I had a remarkable experience. I lived in the little village of Burnfield, next to a house where Titus Sturstein had moved to. And he told me as an old man that as a boy, he was plowing that field. He didn't know anything about what I knew. And he said as he was plowing, the front leg of one of the horses went down up to the shoulder, and he never could figure out why. That's what I can tell you about that.
Thank you. I don't know if you intentionally planned this opening around Thanksgiving weekend, but we're all thinking about Thanksgiving and the myths and the misunderstanding about Native Americans that come from that holiday. I know we can't change the past, but we can hope to change
A question and comment was whether we had purposely planned this launch around the Thanksgiving holiday, which I will let John answer to, and noting that this is a good opportunity to perhaps rewrite a liturgy around Thanksgiving, acknowledging how we have mistreated Native Americans and people of color.
I can't claim any good motives on this. I figured people would be here to visit their family, and we could get them to come here before they went back home. But I don't think that's only commercial. Family together, people. You wouldn't have come here if you wouldn't have cared about the subject. So that's the way I feel about it. Now, the whole mess of Thanksgiving and the turkey and the up from Massachusetts and all that at Plymouth, it's way blown out of proportion. But there's nothing wrong with being thankful. And I guess I forget who first declared Thanksgiving. I'm glad for it. We used to have harvest home services, and with packed houses. Now we don't even have the service here at our church anymore. And just so our Thanksgiving is oblivious of what we inherited and what people enjoyed for a long time before we were over here. And the Indians believed in a great spirit. We don't need to argue with that. It all comes from beyond us, and we are stewards. Now, for the Indian spirituality, let's face it, it's pre-industrial, and it sees what we consider animals and plant life as sentient. That is, it has life in it. It has a kind of a consciousness in it, and they feel part of that. There's nothing wrong with that. They told James, who was it? They told Muhlenberg, who wrote, the wonderful journalist and preacher from Trapp, Frederick Muhlenberg's father-in-law was Conrad Weiser, who understood the Indian mentality, but he said he despaired of trying to get Christian truths into their minds because it had so many concepts that were not, there was no receptors for it because they thought in terms of, they had many words for instance, they didn't have one word for a bear, for a bear. They had many words for different kinds of bears. And they had many words that, which we would consider fractional of things that we thought about different. But the point being that we don't need to oppose what they could give. And I quote Isaac Watts at the end of my book. At the beginning and at the end, I studied hymnody. I thought I was going to be a literature teacher. I wound up writing a thesis on hymns, and I quote Isaac Watts in the first chapter, where he says, "Where nothing dwelt but beasts of prey and savages as wild as they, God builds a city there." And that's what he said in 1719. But he also says something else that I quote and the quote on the book, in which goes something like this: "Seize on the truth where'er it is found, on Christian or on heathen ground." Truth is good where'er it grows. Neglect the prickles and receive the rose. Now that will not suit everybody. The first thing they want to do is prove that the Indians were pagans. Let's do like the Moravians. The Moravians were remarkable. Their pietistic language, it was heart language. And they got closer than we Mennonites didn't even try. So what are we so wise about? We hardly wrote our own history down. Well, those are some of my thoughts. I hope the book won't offend too many people.
We do have one question from online.
All right, let's hear it.
So, John, this project is such a long musing on possession of land, how land came to belong to us, what land ownership means, etc. How has this work changed your own sense of the earth is the Lord's, quote unquote?
Steve, could you repeat that? We couldn't understand that here at the front. Could you repeat that, please?
John, this project is such a long musing on possession of land, how land came to belong to us, what land ownership means, etc. How has this work changed your own sense of the earth is the Lord's?
Can you repeat that? I couldn't get that.
So, your book is a long musing on land and ownership. How has this project shaped your understanding of the phrase "the earth is the Lord's"? Is that a
For one thing, it does. It totally transcends the notion that the earth is legal tender, what you can get out of it. When you walk on your own land, and what makes land my own or anybody else's, or on anybody's land, it's a spiritual thing. To walk on a trail, the Perkiomen Trail or others. It's a spiritual thing. It's not just yoga. It's not just a tool to adjust your mind or anything. You're made out of that, and it's sacred. The earth is, and whether it's beach like Shakamaxon, which now they want to put casinos on. See, I critique the Indians too. You remember Bob Gottschall, was he a representative or a senator? I forget which, at Harrisburg. Anyway, I said to him, what do you think about wanting to take the Crayola place up in there at the Tatami or wherever and put a casino there? He said, let them have it. He said, he was a Pennsylvania Dutchman. He let them have it. He said, we cheated them for everything anyway, so let them have that. I don't think the Indians would demand land back, but I'll tell you, if they felt that we cared enough to mark some place, it would go straight to their hearts. When an Indian at a meeting I was at heard that the Lancaster Mennonites might build a longhouse, he didn't believe they'd do it because not a promise that had ever been made to the Lenapes had been kept. But just the thought that he would think that was so emotional to him that he went home and cried until 2 o'clock in the morning with joy over that. We hardly realize what is out there. And if we could share somehow the land that now we had for 7, 8 generations, the feeling for it, not just as real estate, but if we could share that with the descendants of those whose parents left it. So when we brought the Ketchums up here, they didn't know their way around anywhere at all. But they had an emotional response wherever we touched down. But if we could do that, it would be a spiritual thing. You know, I'll say this yet, if I could. We had a banquet in the basement of this church in 1992. And we had Dee and Annette Ketchum here. He put on his uniform, he danced, or not uniform, his Indian garb. And we had turkey and venison, and we had pumpkin pie and succotash and so forth. And then he gave me that feather. And it didn't mean so much to me at the beginning. I tried to explain, by the way, on that video, that a pen then was a feather. When they heard that it was pen, they called him Feather. And that eagle feather with the little bit of wampum on it was very precious. And when he gave it to me down here in the basement back here, he said, you know, he said, Columbus did bring genocide and awful stuff. But he said somehow he brought along the story of Jesus, who I have in my heart. And I thought, you know, I ought to respond. We should respond to those that feel that way. We should make some gesture We don't have to be right or left to do that, but we could give expression in some way. And my book is more asking how could we do it than what should we do, to be honest.
Thank you, John, for your sharing with us here today and for the challenges and questions you help us to ask in your book. Perhaps you would like to start heading out to the book signing table as I make our closing announcements to get a bit of a head start there. I want to thank each of you again for coming out tonight. This afternoon, it's good to see each of you. I want to make a special thanks to Salford Mennonite Church for hosting us this afternoon. We're very grateful for their support. Out in the lobby, as you came in, you saw we have two tables, one for purchasing books and one where John will be sitting shortly to sign them for you. I would also like to invite you to support the Mennonite Heritage Center and in our work of educating, inspiring, and witnessing to our churches and communities by preserving and interpreting Anabaptist Mennonite stories, by placing a donation in the offering basket that will be at the table as well. Your support is essential to making events such as this possible. I also want to extend a special invitation to our Christmas market and open house next Saturday and Sunday at the Mennonite Heritage Center, where we will have a number of folk art and fine art demonstrators available to help you get a jump on your Christmas shopping. Thank you again for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. Find a book. If you can't find a book here today, you can also find them at the Mennonite Heritage Center on Amazon as well as through Barnes & Noble. Am I correct, Michael? Very good. Thank you all.
Thank you.